everybody. It's Saturday night at 10 o'clock. I am Chris Weave. This is Starfleet Tactical, and the number one rule of using StreamYard to broadcast to YouTube is to hit the Go Live button when you start the show. If you don't hit the Go Live button, all the people out in the audience don't get to be a part of the show. Not that this could ever have happened, ever. So,
certainly not a minute ago.
Certainly not a minute ago. So I'd like to welcome a couple of guests. We've got TJ Zazadlo and Rob Davidoff, who are going to talk about Admirals and Starfleet. We do not have Pat tonight. Pat is going off and being social with his wife. I forget.
Scandalous.
They were going to go off and do something. I forget what it was, but they had plans to go out. And we also don't have Lissa. Lissa is currently dog sitting. So she sent me a picture earlier of some really, really cute puppies that she's taking care of. And she's basically just dealing with dogs right now. So I said,
nice.
I got this. You can have the day off. But luckily, TJ and Rob are able to join me tonight, which is good because first of all, it's good because we had talked about doing this, and second of all, because I'm a little bit behind in doing my reading for whatever my next presentation. So, TJ, how have you been?
I had a root canal earlier this week. So, I'm doing pretty good.
The trajectory can only go up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably worth being a slogan. We could use that as a slogan. Starfleet Tactical, better than a root canal.
Yes.
So, Rob, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. I did some woodworking this weekend, which always feels good for someone who mostly does CAD work.
So you were telling me, so before TJ came back, because TJ and I talked about a half hour ago, and then TJ ran off and did some stuff to get ready for the show and stuff, and Rob and I were talking. Rob was telling me about how he 3D printed a telescope. Yeah,
so I have a friend who did a project over the last 6 months or a year. He got into astronomy and developed a project where you can 3D print. You buy the mirrors off of like Amazon or eBay or
Alibaba,
depending on your preferred level of risk with purchasing things, for like $30, $25, $35, depending on where you buy it. And then you basically 3D print the bits that you get, some rod stock and screws either from McMaster Carr or your local Lowe's or Home Depot. And you basically screw you print the bits that hold it into a tube and that hold the mirrors and all of that. And I built mine over the last week and a half, and it's working great. And I'm hoping that after the show, the clouds will have cleared enough I can go out and look at the moon. So I had built the assembly, but I had it kind of propped up on a tripod or on the back of a chair. But this weekend, a friend of my wife's who has a wood shop let me come over and spent 4 hours building the stand for it. So now I have a good stand for it. And that means don't stand for improper mounting solutions.
Yes, and especially since it needs to be stable if you're actually going to look at anything.
Well, I was able to use so this one can do a 40x and a 150x. The 40x, I could get a really good view of the moon just with like the telescope, the tripod that I was using, but it was way too twitchy because like I'd bump it when I was adjusting the focus, and I wouldn't be pointed at the moon anymore. So this should hopefully solve that problem.
Well, that's pretty cool.
It's a really cool project. I learned about how telescopes work. Apparently he's up to like 20 or 30 people who've built one. So he's continually improving it, and the instructions are pretty cool.
When we
and I should, since I am speaking about 3D printing, I should make it clear I do not speak for any employers, past or present, when I discuss this Star Trek or this 3D printing project, any other 3D printing project I would be talking about, or indeed anything related to Star Trek or Starfleet Tactical.
Yeah, and that of course applies to me too. TJ is self-employed, so at least in theory, he could be speaking for his employer.
TJ speaking for you.
Well, we get onto that in the boilerplate again, but no. I went and I interested for me the past week. I've been reading a set of books that had been sent to me by the author. So in the interest, I did not actually pay for the series, but it's the Breach of Faith series. First one here is Breach of Peace. It's by Daniel Gibbs and Gary T. Stevens. I'm friends with Gary T. Stevens, and that was.
I like the cover.
It's science fiction set in space. I enjoyed it. It's definitely not. There are political thriller aspects to it. There's bang bang shoot 'em up. There's character studies. It's quite good.
Okay.
But again, in the interest, I received my copies for free from the author, which you're supposed to say when you do a review.
You know, it's funny because I just clicked on the Amazon link because I thought, I might as well buy it and at least see how much it costs. And I've discovered that I bought it on December 25th, 2019. So I haven't read it yet. I can buy it. Let's see. Oh, the audiobook is only $7.49. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and buy the audiobook.
Now, the first two books are a two-parter.
Okay.
It's one story over two books because the story got too big.
Yeah, it looks like it's, let's see. Do I see something that says how long it is? Probably if I go back here. Or I could just ask you since you're actually holding it in your hand. 398 pages, it says. So that's pretty good size. That's pretty good size. To the best of my knowledge, the three longest novels in science fiction, so I can't remember where I heard that stat about this, are the three books of the Night's Dawn trilogy by Peter Hamilton, of which the short book is 1,300 pages.
I believe it.
So I once brought a paperback copy of Pandoras Star.
Yeah.
By Peter Hamilton.
Not exactly a short book either.
Well, the funny thing about it is that the paperback, I swear they printed it on thinner than normal paper, so it didn't look larger than other books, because it was like a perfectly normal paperback size, and it's only a little bit thicker. And I brought it to a summer camp, and it was like a 2-week camp, and around like a week in, I realized I've been reading this all week, and I'm not a slow reader, and I'm still like halfway through it. And so much has happened, and I'm not bored. I really, really was liking it. I've reread the series 2 or 3 times, but I was just like, and then I finally, years later, I got it on Kindle, which is great because now it's not a brick. Yeah. And I finally look at it, and it's like, a normal book is maybe 5,000 to 8,000 locations, and Pandora's Star is 14,000 locations.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that makes sense. It is like 2 whole books in one book. That's why the duology feels like a 4-book series, because it is. It's the printing technology that Tolkien never had. If Tolkien had ebooks, the whole Lord of the Rings series would have been 1 book.
Yeah.
Apparently, he was really put out. They couldn't get a binding around the whole thing.
Well, and the binding on the Night's Dawn stuff is so thick that they ended up having to break each one into 2 volumes.
Yeah.
The only reason I made it through the first one, I was on page 400 before I decided that it was worth the effort. And the only reason I kept going was there was enough cool technology. There was enough coolness that I wasn't into the story, but it's like, okay, let's see what other piece of tech he throws out. Let's see what other piece of little, political background he throws out, etc. So it was entirely the background stuff.
I recently read Kim Stanley Robinson's Red Mars, which may surprise some people who know me that I only just now got through it for the first time. But I got through it on my second reading because I gave up on it about 10% in when I was in college at some point. And this time I still like the philosophy of exploration stuff was interesting, but I still think that like the first likable character I'll find in that story might be the first one. Maybe Nadia. Nadia's cool.
But to be honest, I haven't read it. I've owned it for years. I bought it new when it came out, and I haven't read it.
Logic's Finest? I will answer that. I'm not Chris. I will answer my opinion on that at the end of the show tonight. So we don't get further distracted.
Yeah, that's actually probably a good one. I'm trying to find, where is the banner? I want to turn off the banner. I was telling these guys beforehand that there's a lot of stuff. Oh, I'm looking the wrong thing. Okay, there we go. That there's a lot of stuff buried in the StreamYard channel, because all of the Aries Studio channels basically are sharing one branding thing. So anytime I want to find something, I have to dig through Two Geek Girls and all the rest of it in order to find it. So okay, well, I tell you what, why don't we go ahead and do the presentation, and then we'll circle around to questions at the end. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, so and tell
Admirals
me
of the Fleet,
slide.
friend or foe. Next slide. Standard boilerplate. I don't talk for anybody. I'm not. People pay me to copy edit. You guys haven't paid me to copy edit. I haven't paid me to copy edit. I tweet out under the handle @ArnieHolmes, or my other account @TJSaysAdlo. For Arnie Holmes, I'm the editor-in-chief of American Rocket News. We are not a real space news agency most of the time. All of the images in this presentation are courtesy of Memory Alpha. Special thanks to Rob for having sounding board, checked my stuff, helped with some of the thoughts on this. And Rob and I are co-authors on an award-winning piece of alternate history fiction known as Boldly Going: History of an American Space Station. So we're pretty good at alternate history stuff, I think. We had fun writing it, at least. Next slide. So the Admiralty. We're going to be looking at the original series and movies 3, 4, 5, and 6. Chris, what should an admiral in the U.S. Navy be doing?
Well, the admirals have they have jobs just like anybody else in the Navy does. They generally command fleets. They might command like battle groups or things like that. If you go back in history to like the Age of Sail time, you would generally have 3 admirals in a fleet, at least 3. You would have the fleet admiral who was in the middle of the line commanding things. You'd have an admiral at the front of the line, and then you'd have an admiral at the rear of the line. And the admiral at the rear of the line, his main job was in case they did a turn and ended up going the opposite direction, then he'd be at the front of the line. He was generally junior. That's why he was we know that guy today as being the rear admiral. That's where that rank comes from. But admirals are pretty few and far between. I mean, if you think about it, you got a carrier battle group. You've got about 5,000 guys on the carrier. You've got another couple of thousand, maybe 1,500 on the other ships of the fleet. There's one admiral, right? So there's not very many of them around. And if you also think about it in a carrier battle group, he's probably not the oldest guy on board. There's probably a master chief who's might be a little bit older than him, but he's probably one of the 5 oldest people on board, just because you have to have a lot of years of service to get to that rank. And the U.S. Navy in particular is an upper out system. If you're not getting promoted, they thank you for your service and you get to retire and go to the beach.
None of Nelson's Navy's 50-year-old lieutenants.
Yeah, and there was a time period where we had 50-year-old lieutenants too. Right after the Civil War, you'd end up like William McCarty Little, who basically introduced wargaming into the Naval War College, and who has a building that I used to have an office in, named after him at Naval Station Newport. He retired as a lieutenant. And he later got made a captain by like an act of Congress. But I believe he was a lieutenant when he retired. And so admiral is actually it comes from it's a Arabic word. The first admirals were really just generals that went to sea. And there's all sorts of interesting things about how that developed over time. That I won't go into all the details of it, but admirals are generally pretty impressive people. Even the unimpressive ones are impressive, if that makes any sense. You sort of understand how they got there. So they're pretty focused and they're pretty driven, and they generally are pretty smart people.
Okay.
We'll see if that applies to Starfleet.
Yeah. Next slide, please. So our first person over the rank of captain we encounter is in the menagerie. That we're going to evaluate is in the menagerie, parts 1 and 2. Now, throughout this episode, most of what we see of Commodore Mendes is a Telosian projection. He's not. It's not actually Commodore Mendes, but he does. The real Commodore Mendes, who's still back on Starbase 11 throughout the entire thing, gave authorization to suspend General Order 7, which was the last remaining capital crop in the Federation at the time, which implies that he not only has the authority over his starbase, but he has an authority over the area around his starbase, presumably. But again, we don't. The Mendes we see, we're not sure just how much of that is the real Mendes and how much of that is the being a Telosian projection on the end.
I'm going to jump in for just a second.
Okay.
So it's probably worth saying something about the rank of Commodore. So Commodore is an interesting rank. Sometimes it's a rank, sometimes it's just a courtesy title. Its usage has changed over the years. For a while there, right now you've got in the U.S. Navy usage, you've got Rear Admiral lower half and Rear Admiral upper half is how they phrase it, which is that's a 1-star and a 2-star. For a brief period of time there, they called the 1-star rank Commodore.
Yep.
These days, a Commodore generally is a post-command 06 that is in charge of a squadron or a facility, post command, has already had single ship command, is given a job that's bigger than that. But first of all, that's U.S. Navy usage. Everybody does it a little bit differently. Second of all, I don't think we've got a definitive, maybe it is in there somewhere, but I don't think we've got a definitive understanding of exactly how Starfleet uses it. And of course, we're now at the point where we've not only seen several different writers' rooms and how they handle it, but they're writing on shows that cover a time period of 300 years, not including what Discovery's been doing. So when a lot can happen in 300 years. Just look at how we've used the term over the course of the last 300 years in the United States Navy. In fact, we can't look at how we've used that term for 300 years in the United States Navy because we haven't had one for 300 years. So
yeah, one of the really fascinating things is you want to talk about how it's changed over the years. He's a commander of a star base. He's a Commodore. Benjamin Sisko starts the show as a commander. And even once he becomes, and arguably at the start of the pilot, it's a backcountry posting that's a joint base. So he's really just commanding the local Starfleet contingent, not really even the station. Station commander is like a joint role that's being awarded him by the local forces. But, by the end of the pilot, and certainly by the end of like the first or second season, he's commanding a region of space of critical importance to the Federation. And eventually they assign him a dedicated starship, and he's got broad authority over the other side of the wormhole. And so they kick him all the way up to captain.
Yeah. And one of the things that's interesting about how in U.S. usage, the captain, the commander of a naval base is generally an 06, right? If it's like the commander of Pearl Harbor, Naval Station Pearl Harbor is an 06. He is a captain. His tenant commands on board on Naval Station Pearl Harbor might have admirals working for them, right? Yeah. And so same thing, like, I don't know, pick Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, for instance, which is fairly close to where I live. And fairly
base commander's in 06, if I remember correctly, and they've got, in 07 or in 08 at Materiel Command?
There's Air Force Material Command has a 4-star.
Oh, that's right.
Air Force Research Lab has a 2-star. There are multiple admirals at Air Force Material Command. I don't know what the commander of Air Force Institute of Technology is, probably an 06, but probably an 06. There's other tenant commands on that base that there might be another admiral or two hiding around there.
The NASIC either has a high 06 or a low 07.
Yeah, and I'm not sure about that at
person I'd ask on that isn't around right now. So
at the Office of Naval Intelligence, there was a flag officer there, so there was an admiral in charge.
But I think something that's interesting is that we do see in this era of Starfleet, the show is pretty consistent on this over its run, that starbase commanders are Commodores.
Yes.
We see sometimes there's indications starbases may have multiple Commodores on them, which we'll get into when we get to
the next slide.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, so the commander of a base is U.S. Navy base is responsible for basically defending the base and making the base do the base thing, right? But they don't actually control any of the forces on the base, right? They're the landlord, but they're not the operating forces on the base. So they may own some tugboats, but they don't own the ships. They own the piers, but not the ships. Yep. The Chinese, until recently, had this structure where the base commander owned the ships. And so it's unclear to me exactly how Starfleet does it. And it's also unclear to me, okay, he's the commander of Starbase 11. Is Starbase 11 just the starbase, or is Starbase 11, when you say Starbase 11, are you also talking about a region of space around it? Is there a separate organization to which those ships are assigned to? I don't know.
Why don't we jump ahead, because I think we get into that in the next slide.
Yep.
Oh, perfect. All right, back to you, TJ.
Now we move on to the next episode where we see one, and it's Commodore Stone, who is not described as the commander. He is described as the port master on Starbase 11. And we're not told what that means specifically in any of this. Just that he is presumably in charge of the repairs that are being carried out to the Enterprise when...
He actually makes a specific comment on prioritization of repair teams.
Yes. He's wearing red. He is not on the command track. He is on the engineering track. And as an out of universe bit, Commodore Stone is the highest ranking person of color that we see in a command position in the Federation in the original series. But yes, he's in charge of like maintenance and such, prioritizing the repair teams. And he's referred to as the president of the court that is conducting the court martial.
The eponymous court martial.
Yes.
Apparently it's a pretty routine practice that when crew members die on a Federation starship, that they review it and they determine if they need to have a court martial. I know that this was sort of a standard if a ship was lost. Certainly in Nelson's Navy, I know they had a court martial because it features in a bunch of Aubrey Maturin or Hornblower books to determine if there was any to as a routine procedure that everyone who loses a ship gets court-martialed, so that when we let you off, if we let you off, you can. It's not just that we didn't let you go to court; it's that you had your day in court and we decided you didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah, a court is an investigative activity, and so if it's something serious and they need to do an investigation, they'll do a court martial. I mean, that's like if you lose an aircraft, there's some sort of investigation like that. If somebody dies, there's an investigation like that. And a lot of it is that is the mechanism whereby militaries get stuff on the record.
Yeah, Stone seems pretty put together. He doesn't seem malicious towards Kirk. He's not. He has a little Columbo twist where he's asking Kirk some questions out of his log, and Kirk is giving his answers, and he's like, I jettisoned the pod after the red alert, and Stone kind of turns the monitor around and is like, here's the camera showing you pushing it before the red alert.
Yes.
So sort of very Columbo. But he stays on the events of the episode happen, the ship is in trouble.
Yep. He stays on the Enterprise, even when the ship is in trouble, even being offered a chance to evacuate.
So it's actually kind of interesting, the entire wearing red thing. In the U.S. Navy, you've got something called an engineering duty officer. So you might find these guys running a shipyard, but you won't find them commanding a ship. That Star Trek is a little bit different in that regard, in that there were plenty of times where Kirk turned over the ship to Scotty.
Yeah.
Even though Scotty wasn't technically command track.
If you look at the sort of the beta canon stories behind the Kobayashi Maru, Scotty, the beta canon story is that the Kobayashi Maru scenario is designed to keep throwing Klingon ships at you until you lose, if you decide to fight. And that Scotty, knowing how the scenario worked and was able to finagle basically a cheat way through it, he got up to like fighting 40 Klingon ships with his one ship before he lost. So the story is that Scotty had taken the command track courses, but then went into engineering.
So your uniform color may reflect a variety of certifications, perhaps.
Yes.
One of them possibly. This is next gen, but we see Deanna Troi in a blue uniform taking bridge officer certification. That she is allowed to command. She is allowed to be the officer of the deck on the bridge.
Yeah, and it's in fact, I believe in that episode it even says that if you want to get promoted beyond lieutenant commander, you have to be certified as a bridge officer.
Doesn't mean you commanded, but at least Scott appears to be in a position where he's past that and can do it.
Yep. Well, it may very well be that the captain has the authority to sort of determine who is in the chain of command, and basically he gets to set what the chain of command on his ship looks like in terms of who's authorized to sit in the chair. For a tactical action officer on a ship, that's basically how it works. Is you get what's known as the TAO letter from the commanding officer. And so you may have been TAO on your past ship, but until you come on board the next ship, and until the commanding officer gives you the TAO letter, you're not authorized to be the tactical action officer. So that's just how that works. So it may very well be that Kirk was making an exception. It may be that it was an exception, but not a exceptional exception, right? There's a lot of those that are made. Or it may just very well be that really when push comes to shove, the color of the uniform is more about which branch you're currently assigned to, in the same way that every Marine is an infantryman. It's just that some of those infantrymen are currently functioning as the finance guy, but they're still an infantryman, right? The Marines are interesting about this stuff. Like, they've only got one combat arm, and that's infantry. Everybody else is combat support.
Yep.
Like, the tanks are combat support. They're not combat arms back when they had tanks.
So next slide. Oh yeah, I slotted this one in here. Matt Decker. Again, he's a Commodore. He's here because he's a Commodore in this particular instance. He's commanding at least one ship. We don't know what Constitution was doing prior to her encounter with the planet killer. He's here more for completeness. Check earlier versions of Starfleet Tactical for a more in-depth discussion on Matt Decker. Next slide. Stalker. George Stalker he's being transported by the Enterprise to Starbase 10 when pretty much the entire command staff of the Enterprise is getting incapacitated with the disease that makes them age. Like Stalker, like Stone. I had these slides flipped, and that's more red. He is probably a quite capable administrator and engineer, but he's really out of his depth in commanding a starship. He doesn't have the experience, and he makes some pretty bad decisions, but they're able to, and definitely comes off as seeing the capabilities of a starbase as being better than the capabilities of a starship, even if they have equivalent medical facilities.
Yeah, Wright had a good comment back a few minutes ago. Ability and talent speaks volumes about who can command. Stalker is an interesting example about that. I think he often gets written off as should never be in command of a starship, and that may be right. But on the other hand, this gets back to that question of, do starbases have an area of command? Because Kirk includes him in some of the conversations, specifically because Gamma Hydra 4 is going to be in your area of operations. Now, whether that means just that this is areas where ships based out of Starbase 10 are going to be operating. He's in red. Perhaps he's in Stone's role. Perhaps he's portmaster for Starbase 10. I was looking at the transcript before the show started, but I didn't actually control F commander. So what exactly role he's taking over Starbase 10 at. But he comes off like he doesn't take command lightly. He tries to get Spock to take command. And then when Spock doesn't divert them and keeps them on course for their current mission, he thinks Spock may also be being incapacitated, and he's just being affected by the aging less because he's Vulcan. But he seems like he's used to procedure, and he's used to the capabilities of a starbase and to solving problems with those, and that he's perhaps deeply uncomfortable solving problems with anything with a crew of less than 1,000 and an impulse engine.
Yeah.
So he may be used to throwing resources at problems instead of kind of finagling a solution from one ship.
Yep. Next slide, please. Bob Wesley, again, we talked about him on a previous presentation. He's here for the sake of completeness.
But notably, the first time we see a yellow uniform Commodore who is assigned at the start of the episode to command multiple
ships.
Yeah, I don't know that we've ever seen anything from a canon source that says whether uniform color is indicative of career path or just current assignment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, does Scotty wear red because he's engineering track or because he's engineering department? And it may very well be that there's clearly people have strengths and weaknesses, and Stalker is clearly not a guy you're going to give a starship command to. But is he wearing red because he's the equivalent of an engineering duty officer, or is he wearing red because that's just,
that's his track?
Because he's the portmaster, and portmaster is the highest ranking engineering officer for a sector.
Yeah, and Bob Wesley is functioning as the CO of the Lexington. In addition to being the Commodore of that particular group, he is an active duty. He's got a starship command, so he's wearing yellow. He's a command department guy, and so it's never been really clear to me. I'm sure that there's something somewhere that people have put together on that, but I don't recall. There being anything authoritative in Sternbach and Okuda about that. But
I think the closest thing we get is in the JJ verse when Chekhov changes shirt color when he gets transferred to the acting chief engineer.
And that's in the JJ verse, and it may actually be right despite that.
Yeah.
And of course, yeah. So
yes, TOS also gave us fleet captains both for Garth and Pike, which I would note that the two fleet as Logic's Finest pointed out, TOS gave us fleet captain Garth, a man who commands more than one ship as an admiral. TOS didn't always follow naval protocols. I would note that we see two fleet captains in TOS. We see Pike and we see Garth. And both the times we see fleet captains, we see them in conjunction with someone who is not commanding a group of ships and is in fact incapacitated for one reason or another.
Yeah, although
like maybe you don't want to be promoted to fleet captain. It may come with the Purple Heart.
Yeah. Well, in the Russians do weird things with their naval ranks. They have things like senior captain as a separate rank, or senior colonel as a separate rank, and so that very well just may be the equivalent of he's 06 and a half. Right, he got promoted to 06 and a half. And that actually leads to an interesting discussion that I've had with Andy Presby and a few other people, especially relevant in terms of the Honorverse, where in the Honorverse, with the advent of Prolong, everybody's living way, way, way longer. Do you have enough ranks?
Yeah.
If you assume that a career goes from being 20 years to being 80, or at least has the potential to being 80, do you have enough ranks? Or do you just resign yourself to the fact that, you're going to be an ensign for 15 years before you get promoted?
This becomes the problem with Tuvok in Voyager, and with other Vulcans, where it's like Tuvok's been in, maybe out, maybe back in of Starfleet for, we're shown on screen like 80 years, something like that.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting thing. It reminds me of a book called Fire on the Border by Kevin O'Donnell, which is a fantastic little book. It's actually a fantastic, fairly good-sized book. And it's one of those books that has the feature of a tactically useful FTL drive, but all the sensors and weapons are speed of light. So I really like that. But in that particular Navy, you could serve for 20 years at a time. Human lifespans are like 150 years. You can serve for 20 years at a time, and then you were required to take 5 years off. And what usually ended up happening is people would go off and get their PhD or something like that.
Yep.
And then they joined back in, but you were required to take a 5-year break. That actually sounds like a kind of nifty idea.
Next slide. So we have a number of other admirals and commodores that show up in the show, but that are really only there as for exposition and set dressing. You'll note that among the 6 positions, one of them we only hear from, and he's voiced by James Doohan. And the other 5 are only played by 3 actors. So we get Byron Moro showing up twice, and we get Richard Durr showing up twice, at both times as different officers. Going on my notes through this, we have Barstow, who, while a Commodore, is stated that he is ordered all units withdrawn within a 100-second parsec of the radius where he's sending the Enterprise to do the investigation, because it's the alternate factor. It's the one with like the anti-matter mirror universe shenanigan person. Other notes. Enright, who again we don't see, we only hear, he's Commodore Enright, and he's stated as being the commander of Starbase 6. And Admiral Fitzpatrick in Trouble with Tribbles is the only admiral in the entire original series that we see the full uniform tunic on. He is the only one that we actually get to see the full rank insignia, and from his rank insignia and others, we can presume he's either a 2-star or a 3-star. I don't remember which it is, and I forgot to put it in my notes. But all in all, we have a fair number of them, but they're set dressing.
There is one I'll point out isn't in here, speaking of Trouble with Tribbles, which is Station Master Lurie from Trouble with Tribbles, who I don't think has a rank that's stated in the episode from a quick check.
Does not, which is why he's not on the list.
Yeah, so K7, apparently, not a starbase. Doesn't have a commander, doesn't have a Commodore.
Yep.
And I don't think he outranks Kirk, because he can't order Kirk to do things.
He can't, and Kirk was ordered to provide support by Fitzpatrick.
So what exactly his rank is, don't know offhand, but
so it's always interesting, the question of who can give orders to whom, because if you're not in their chain of command, and you've gotten your orders, and an admiral gives you orders, and you run into an admiral, he gives you orders that violate your previous orders, you get to respectfully tell him no. It's like, I have my orders, sir. You're not in my chain of command. My chain of command gave me the orders, et cetera, et cetera. There's actually a very interesting article I was reading earlier about the fire on the Bonhomme Richard, and how that all went down, and the results of the investigation, et cetera. And at one point, it involved one admiral calling up another admiral who was a lower rank, but in a different chain of command, and saying, Bob, you can tell me to F off if you want to, but here's what I would suggest that you do. And I mean, he didn't call them up and give them orders. He called them, because different chain of command, he called them up and said, my recommendations are.
If I had to make an effort to reify all of this, I think what I would say is that they have Commodores that are commanding ships or groups of ships, like Wesley and possibly also Decker, who maybe have authority within like a region of survey or for a dedicated mission like the M5 test. That within General Federation space, you report to the local starbase Commodore, who is the commander of that operational space. And then you have a port master also at every starbase who's responsible for, when the ships come back, turn them around and get them going again.
Yeah, it might be that port master and starbase commander are really the same thing, though.
Maybe, but we do see, I think we see two admirals in different color uniforms. One of the yellow shirt is the commander, and the red shirt is a portmaster.
Yep,
And if
that
you
was
assume that they are both serving on the same facility at the same time.
Do we know that it was at the same time?
No, but within same season. So either they got it.
Yeah, okay, same season.
That's
close. That's close.
So that would be interesting if you, and that's a way to reify it, that what is his name? Perez commands the region.
Mendes
commands the region and the ships in the region, and then Stone turns them around when they come back and need assistance, or if they run into like mechanical issues and they need help getting home or whatever.
So I just threw up this quote from that Wright put in the chat, because I find Wright and I had a long conversation about this idea he's got for a story, and maybe doing a fan film or something someday about it, about Decker, and he's a big Decker fan, and that sort of thing. He's basically, the way it seems to work with these starships is that they're basically the cop on the beat. They're sort of the local roving guy. And so, they're probably the senior guy in that particular area. And so it may very well be that, you're assigned to that area, and you're just sort of told, if you run into this guy, treat him like he's your boss, because he is for those purposes, right? He's the senior guy. They're all in the same chain of command, and he would be the senior officer present.
Yeah.
Yep. Next slide. And we skip over the first two movies, because in the first two movies we only have one other admiral mentioned, and that's Admiral Magura, who's described as Kirk's boss in the motion picture. And other than it taking a whole lot of convincing to get Kirk to took a lot of Kirk to convince Magura to give him back the Enterprise. That's the extent of what we have on Magura. So our first one comes up with Moro, and he describes himself as Commander Starfleet. What that means is not defined, except that he pins Jim into Earth, following the events of the Wrath of Khan. He orders Kirk to stay put. Not very successfully, but he does that, and he says he's doing it as his friend. And there's supposed to be an established working relationship and friendship between the two of them. He is also the person who gives us the infamous "The Enterprise is 20 years old," which doesn't really fit well with established age of the ship. It's either Kirk has had the Enterprise for 20 years, they zeroed out the space frame before Kirk got it, or he's talking about just how long. Or he misspeaks. Because the events of the search for Spock supposed to take place in 2285. The refit takes place between about 2270 and 2273. And Kirk presumably took command of the Enterprise sometime around 2265. So the Enterprise is 20 years old. It's really hard to sort of make that fit with some of the other.
If it is 20 years old, Pike never had a chance to peel all the plastic off the screens.
Maybe it takes into account all the time travel. I'm sorry, I was channeling Gene Roddenberry there.
My personal pet theory is that following like 15, 20 years of service, they zero-houred the space frame on Enterprise prior to Kirk getting it. And then when she goes in for the refit following Kirk's 5-year voyage, they don't re-zero-hour out the space frame, because it was just done 5 years ago.
Despite the fact they did more to the frame. Now,
yeah,
how that holds together is...
You got to come up with something.
Yeah. So anyway, The other thing I'd like to point out is we are back at Earth, and for the first time, we have an admiral physically in the room with our heroes.
Yeah,
we have not. I think in the previous ones, we never have an admiral who's in the room. We're back at Earth, and the commander at Starfleet walks into your house
or your bar.
or your bar.
Next slide, please. The Federation Council. This is the scene in A Voyage Home where you get the Klingon Ambassador going, James T. Kirk, renegade and terrorist. That I rewatched that scene in the last day just to make sure I had the right mindset with the number of people in Starfleet uniforms in those benches. It's really, that's a lot of military uniforms for a legislature. Even if that's a committee on the legislature, that's a lot of uniforms. Next slide, then. Unless, do you have something to say? This was a last minute addition on the slides. So I don't know. A whole lot of notes. Next. Cartwright. Cartwright shows up in the voyage home. He's the admiral in the bunker with the Federation president. He is talking about fleet assets. He's talking about they've lost 2 starships and 3 smaller ships, and he's the one who gives the planetary red alert order. Now, how much of him is him being in a position to order the planetary red alert based on his position, and how much of it is he's the admiral in the bunker with the president. Therefore, when that guy orders red alert and the president doesn't countermand it, you do planetary red alert. And he also comes back in the Undiscovered Country as one of the conspirators. And you either have the conspiracy in an undiscovered country thrown together in 2 months from scratch, or maybe Cartwright's somebody who knew, say, a Klingon naval attaché who had spent time in Paris and had, on occasion, gone up to Stratford-upon-Avon to visit Shakespeare's second home in the galaxy. And that may be where the connections are, the interpersonal connections you get between the Federation and Klingon conspirators in that movie. Per the Voyage Home novelization, he's described as having been the CNC. Again, it's kind of vague because of events that we see show up in later movies, specifically in the Undiscovered Country, where he is not the CNC. Next slide. Bob. Harv Bennett plays Admiral Bob. The exchange between Kirk and Bob is horribly informal. At no point does Kirk refer to him as Admiral or by the last name. At no point does Admiral Bob do anything other than chastise Kirk for showing up in a Go Climb a Rock t-shirt. And this is an exchange that takes place on the main view screen with not just senior officers and bridge officers around, but you have technicians repairing the bridge. And that's presumably low-ranked technicians repairing the bridge who are privy to this particular discussion.
It's a great example of a scene that should have been in a ready room.
Yeah.
The exchange might not, the familiarity of the exchange might not have been out of place in a ready room or in a briefing room of senior officers, but it's a little weird to have on the open bridge.
Absolutely.
And we only know his name is Bob?
We only know his name is Bob.
Okay, in my headcanon, that's Robert April.
Ooh, interesting.
Wouldn't that be nifty?
That would be really nifty.
That's one way. One thing to note is that all of the admirals that we are talking about in the movie era all wear the same rank insignia. They all are wearing Fleet Admiral insignia. The credit line at the end of the movie describes him as chief, or lists him as Chief of Staff, as Starfleet Chief of Staff.
Okay.
Third movie, third admiral, third rank.
Yeah, it only gets worse from here. I like very much, as you can see on that line, Kirk is saying the Enterprise isn't ready for this, and Bob goes and says, Kirk commanding a ship that's half falling apart is better than another commander with a ship that is intact, which means I get to tell you to go. And that is very much the mindset that ends up getting Kirk killed. That if Kirk is there, Kirk can solve anything, pull anything out of a.
Yeah, this is very much what ends up happening with the Enterprise B. If you want to say that there is an institutional failure, that Kirk has been told he can solve any problem with a half-broken ship. He has been told he can solve any problem with a half-broken ship.
In defense of Starfleet, he was only mostly dead.
But
it's not even that it's not just that they send Kirk with a half-broken ship. There are explicitly other ships. You can send a half-broken Enterprise and a fully functional Saratoga.
Yeah, why not send him 1.5 ships instead of a half a ship?
Or he can. They've got these things that I believe. What do they call that thing? It's called a transporter. They could use the transporter to move him to the unbroken ship.
Right. That then gets into the whole putting Kirk though on another ship does not tend to bode well for the other ship's captain.
Yeah, so this is part of our ongoing attempt to rehabilitate John Harriman.
Yes. Harriman survived Kirk on the ship. Not always. Spock didn't. Decker didn't. Other Decker didn't.
Don't let Kirk on your bridge.
Yeah. In most of the support materials, most people refer to him as Robert Bennett, because he's played by Harv Bennett. So
Robert April. I'm sticking to my guns on this one.
All right. Next slide, then, please. It's not a bad theory, though. Bill Smiley is described as the CNC. Fourth movie, fourth rank, fourth admiral, and this time we see him with Cartwright. He is only ever referred to by anybody as either the CNC or Bill. And at the briefing at the start of the movie, he knows what he wants. He knows exactly what he wants. He wants the Flagstaff there. He wants Kirk and Kirk's staff there. And he gets them all there to basically to go and tell them what he wants.
I thought that was worth throwing up.
And this gets back into the Kirk can solve anything scenario of he personally wants Kirk to be escorting the Chancellor to Earth because the Klingons won't do anything if Kirk's the guy on the scene. So he either has faith in Kirk or he has faith in the mythos that the Klingons have around Kirk to keep them from doing anything. The second line is, it was Spock's. Mech 1164 says, well, it was Spock's idea. Yes, but he goes along with it. The second quote line we have there is from a deleted scene in The Undiscovered Country. It's a
So
scene
in the
that
undiscovered country, Kirk and
McCoy.
McCoy end up in Klingon custody for assassinating the Klingon Chancellor, which they did not commit. They are sent to a maximum security facility. They promptly escape.
This is actually before they are sent to the maximum security facility. This is when they're being sent on trial. The Bill, Cartwright, and Colonel West, one of their aides, go in and present to the Federation president a plan to go and get Kirk and McCoy out. And this presentation is made on paper with an easel in front of the Federation president and the Romulan ambassador to the Federation. Which was, why is the Romulan ambassador at that particular?
You figure the Tal Shiar is going to find out anyway, you might as well invite them.
The Federation president declines Operation Retrieve. And Bill, throughout the entire bit, he simply says, "We want to." Bill's only lines in this scene are, "We want to present this to you." He lets West and Cartwright push for the plan along with the Romulan ambassador. And when the Federation president says, "No, we're not going to do it," Bill waits for everybody else to get out of the room except for the president and him. And he delivers the line, "Mr. President, those men have literally saved this planet." And the president responds with, "I know that. Now they're going to save it again by standing trial." It's a very good line. It's very well delivered.
And it's very notable he waits until the conspirators are out of the room before he endorses their plan to declare war on the Klingon Empire.
So do I remember correctly that Cartwright was also listed as being commander-in-chief?
In a novelization that came out before this movie.
Cartwright's rank is in the bunker, can call planetary red alert.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. But it was in the novelization that he was listed as CNC. So it is worth pointing out. I don't know if this is relevant in this case or not. Back before World War I. In fact, I'm not sure exactly when this changed. The most senior permanent rank in the United States Navy was Rear Admiral. And anybody who was higher than Rear Admiral, you pinned on the stars with the job. And so you became, like when you were the chief of naval operations, you pinned on the extra stars and you had them while you were CNO. And then when you stopped being CNO, you took the stars off and you went back to being a Rear Admiral, and you might go do something else. And so those only became permanent ranks. Vice Admiral and above only became permanent ranks fairly late. I can't remember if it was before World War I or not, but it might have actually been sometime after, like in the 20s.
We have Kirk in the motion picture being described as Chief of Starfleet Operations.
Yeah, and so that's a very interesting
as a 2-star.
That's a very interesting description, right? Because on the one hand, the chief of naval operations is a 4-star who is the senior military officer in the United States Navy. But, you've also got the operations guys, right? The N5 shop. So there's a deputy chief of naval operations for operations, basically. And so when he's chief of Starfleet operations, does that mean that he's running Starfleet, or he's the guy who's in charge of all the different things that Starfleet goes out and does, like, where they send ships to, right? Operations as opposed to logistics, as opposed to intelligence, as opposed to plans, etc. That he's the current op guy. So he's the guy that makes assignments of missions to ships, or is he the guy that runs all of Starfleet? I've never been able to figure that out.
I would tend toward actually the former.
That he's the guy who gives them missions?
Yeah, he's the guy who gives the missions.
As a
Because as a
sense
2-star, and because we know that he's got Nagura above him.
Yeah.
He has a boss.
Yeah.
And I think it also, if you think about what they may be lining Kirk up for, put him behind a desk and make him be on the other end of the phone for a few years before you kick him further up the chain.
Yeah.
He's never been a commander of a starbase, so maybe that may be what they're
Or a
doing.
flotilla.
Yeah. Give him an operational area and make him deal with it.
And the other thing is that he's a really good judge of character, and he's been out there. You know, he's done all the shit, right? So it makes sense to put him in. He's exactly the type of guy that you would want in that job. It's also worth pointing out that admirals will frequently have more than one hat, right? A lot of different things. You can have more than one job, and admirals frequently have more than one job. And for instance, I don't know if it's still structured this way, but back when I was working at the Center for Naval Analysis, 15 plus years ago, 20 years ago, there was Commander ASW Forces Pacific and Commander Submarine Pacific. Same dude. There was an admiral who had two hats. He had two different chiefs of staff. He had two different staffs. There were two different organizations. It happened to be the same guy at the top. They were in the same building, and they shared an operations center together, but they were two different jobs with two different Navy 06s as the chief of staff. I don't know if he had two deputies or not, but two entirely different staffs.
Interesting. The old saw about there are only two types of ships would suggest that being commander of submarines and commander of anti-submarine warfare is a conflict of interest.
Well, no, except he wasn't hunting our submarine, except in exercises.
There's only two kinds of submarines. There's only two kinds of ships.
Can we move on to the final slide, though, please, while we have this discussion?
Yeah, and then we'll come back.
Yeah. So in the generalized takeaways in TOS, as we mentioned before, Starbase Commander seems to be a pretty heavily on a Commodore. We see some in command. We see others in ops. We have we have 4 different positions in 4 different people in over 4 different movies. There was making all of that work is something that is not easy. I've seen at least one fan explanation of how you sort of org chart everything out. But it's part of the problem of having had 4 different production teams, 4 different directors, 4 different writers for the movies. That said, everybody's wearing a 5-star rank insignia, which to me almost screams pretty top heavy. You've got 4 different 5 stars in those positions. Now, maybe it's not if the fleet's a lot bigger, but
I'd be willing to bet you that if you go to the prop department, they've got 1 set.
No.
They've got to have at least 2 sets. They film scenes with 2 of those guys in the same room.
Okay, then they've got 2 sets. Just like if you look at, I forget which one of the movies, but in one of the movies, if you look at Geordi's uniform, his sleeves come to here because
generations.
Yeah, because they were too cheap to make extra uniforms, and so they updated the uniforms to the Deep Space Nine standard, and they were
they actually took Deep Space Nine uniforms.
No. Right. That's what I'm saying. They updated them to Starfleet updated to that standard. The production crew just took the uniforms and moved them over to the movie, whether they fit or not.
Yeah.
Let's see. Hello to my brother DeLon, who just said that he's not here tonight, but he dropped by to say hi to everyone. So hello, DeLon.
Hello, DeLon. There
was one other example I was going to give us of an admiral having 2 jobs. In World War II, Ernest King was both Commander U.S. Fleet and Chief of Naval Operations. So Commander U.S. Fleet is an operational command, right? He owned the ships. The Chief of Naval Operations is administrative and support, all these other things, and he's also functions as the naval advisor to the president. At this point, you didn't have the Joint Chiefs like you do today. So his boss was the president, not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, for purposes of that. And they, once again, two different staffs, two different buildings, etc. And there were incidents where Ernest W. King, Commander U.S. Fleet, Commander-in-Chief U.S. Fleet, sent a request to Ernest W. King, Chief of Naval Operations, and the CNO denied the request.
Yep.
And so you look at that and you go like, what the hell? And it's like, okay, this is about getting something on the record, right? This is about it made sense for Sincus Fleet to ask the question, to make the request. It's like, why didn't he ask for this? He did. And then this gave him the ability to respond to it and explain why you shouldn't do that, right? Or why we're not going to do it. It's all about getting it on the record. So sometimes these things look really silly, but they've got mundane explanations. It's about getting something on the record.
I have an observation that's on here that's not on here that just occurred to me while we were talking through it, which is that in TOS, all the Commodores that are ever in the room with our crew when they're on the frontier are everyone who's in the room is a Commodore. All the admirals are phoning in. When we're in the movies, we spend most of them based from Earth, and we only see admirals and pretty senior ones. We're dealing with much more like matters of state. So I think it's sort of interesting. It goes back to that point of Commodores are on the frontier and admirals TOS are closer to home.
Am I correct that in the movie era and before, the only admiral we see off out of the solar system is Kirk in the first movie?
In the first movie. And he apparently he had to go to his boss and argue long and hard to get onto the ship.
We don't know where
he had to go and argue to get onto the the ship that was a disaster, et cetera, because he's the guy who can go out and he on a half put together ship is better than any. Yeah.
Okay. Comac in Amok Time is described as Commander Sector 9, and he is an admiral.
Okay.
Oh, okay. All right.
Sector 9 sounds like a big enough number that maybe he's not on Earth.
Yeah.
But he's got a sector, not a starbase.
Yes.
Maybe a sector has multiple starbases.
Maybe. Mech 1169 says no. They had to, since there had to be new uniforms for generations, and it got nixed at the last minute, so they had to get uniforms from Deep Space Nine. Yeah, they actually got prototype toys made of the action figures. That there are prototype action figures of what was originally supposed to be the Generations uniform floating around, and it looks incredibly like what they've ended up using for lower decks.
Okay, then.
Now I just wonder if that's where the inspiration came from. We've had the Spock helmet.
Yep.
The lower decks uniforms is being inspired. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's where the connection was, because it's got the flap and everything.
Yeah.
So,
actual Operation Retrieve move. Now I'm kind of curious.
No. It's the. I think it's stuff that. Hold on a second.
It's
the Starship Modeler Convention. Apparently,
if it's the
easel.
It's the easel with the paper on it, or just the easel? Oh, yeah. See, it's weird.
Zooming in.
It's weird because he's not on Rurapente yet. unless they're presuming that they're not going to be able to launch Operation Retrieve until he gets to Rurapente.
Or that
Maybe they assume that there are going to be more ships around wherever the trial is held.
Or just that that's the destination. So, put it in big letters. Oh, but there, yeah.
They may
Eagle,
just be
Potemkin, and Excelsior, as well as Endeavor, Emden, and Ahwani.
I think my Artemis Bridge group requires me to just call out the good ship TSN Eagle, the only ship I'm aware of to beat the Artemis equivalent of the Kobayashi Maru. Because we ran out our slot after an hour and a half, and they still hadn't killed us.
Cool. Okay. So,
future sections of this presentation have not been built yet. So the TNG presentation, the TNG Deep Space Nine presentations are going to probably take quite a bit longer, just because we deal with a whole lot more.
Yeah,
staff.
There's a bunch of them. So there was something else I was going to say. Oh, that Operation Retrieve thing. This is a pet peeve of mine. I am so tired of two-dimensional representations of space in Star Trek. And it's like, okay, I understand it's hard to do it in 3 dimensions. I don't have a solution. I don't pretend that I have a solution. But I've actually come to the conclusion that I don't think anybody actually understands what the relationship between all these different stellar powers are, first of all, because I'm not convinced that they're all in this flat plane. And it's, in its own way, it's even worse than trying to figure out, Middle Earth, right? Middle Earth is famously bad because unless you go to the Iron Crown Enterprise map set, you basically, everything takes place in Western Europe, and the farthest you ever see to the east is Turkey and Poland. And it's like there's an entire continent over there, guys, right? It's not like Mordor was up against the end of the world and there was nothing on the other side. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on over there. And we see the same thing, and that Operation Retrieve stuff is just another example of that. Is it's way more complicated than that. And like I said, TV is 2-dimensional. I don't have a solution.
I'm imagining that if they'd been forced to do that in Treasure Planet style, that they flip up the cover page and it projects out a volumetric hologram, and then they flip the page and it projects out a different hologram, and then they need to refer back to the previous one, and they flip it back down and it changes it.
That could work. These days, if you were going to do it, you do it like Prometheus, right? The 3-dimensional. The 3-dimensional map when they get to the engineers, the Aliens movie.
Oh, the Aliens movie. I was thinking of Voyager.
No. The Aliens movie where they've got the 3-dimensional map. You can do that. You can show the 3 dimensions. You can move stuff around, etc. But you can't do that if you print it out on a piece of paper.
Hold on a second. I want to show you something because I thought you were going to be about the name being really on the nose.
Okay, Mech1169 says, that's a nice infographic. Why didn't they bring a screen to put on the easel? I would note that West and Cartwright were both involved in the conspiracy. And it's from The Wire. It's a line delivered by Idris Elba about, are you taking notes on a criminal conspiracy? Would you want to put information from your conspiracy into the Federation computer banks?
No, I thought you were going to talk about the naming everything incredibly on-the-nose names, which bugs my wife to no end. She's really annoyed with all these science fiction things that call their stuff Icarus, and then they're surprised when everything explodes.
Yes. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, like, why are all these sports teams named the Trojans? I seem to recall they lost.
Yeah. So anyway.
Oh, so that wraps up the presentation that I have completed. I'm sorry we went over by about 20 minutes.
That's okay. I'm totally okay with going over. I try not to go too late when Pat is on and when Lissa's on, but when I'm by myself, hey, let's do 4 hours.
I've got stuff starting at the beginning of next week. I can't do 4 hours.
Yeah, I know. I can't either. Actually, I've got to be productive. I've got some work stuff I need to do tomorrow. So, but all right. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for coming on the show tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
And I'm looking forward to the next installment.
Yeah.
Gosh,
well,
I'd
like to say that as far as bad admirals go, one of the questions of this was how bad are bad admirals? I think there were 9 to 12 that we covered, and I think you can only really say Cartwright
and maybe Fitzpatrick.
Yeah.
We spent a remarkably brief period of time talking about the fact that one of them is quite literally a traitor.
Yes.
Chris, you're not allowed to talk about who's a traitor. It's not polite.
So, well. All right, everybody, let's go ahead and call it.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Peace and long life.
Now we need to go find the going away thing. Where's the going away thing? Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.